If you want to get stronger in Wuthering Waves, you need to get better echoes. Many players take a relaxed approach and spend their daily wave plates on tacit fields, while others want to rid their world of TDs one by one. If you fall into the second category, you might be wondering, is Roccia the best echo farmer in the game, or is she just another support living in Sanhua's shadow? Before we get to testing that, we need to define what makes a character good at echo farming. For me, it all comes down to these 3 points. A great echo farmer doesn't ever need to be swapped out with another character. In other words, they should be strong enough to decimate TD populations without any sort of standard party rotation. Not only that, but they need good, quick, and easy AoE damage, so I don't have to chase groups of enemies around. And finally, resonance liberations should be avoided at all costs because the animation takes too long. Those few seconds really add up over time. In the early days, Yinlin was my go-to because she meets at least some of these criteria, but it's kind of cheating because my Yinlin is sequence 6. If you didn't know, her Resonance Liberation at S6 enables the most ridiculously wide-ranging AoE of any attack in the game. But therein lies the problem. She has to use her Resonance Liberation to be more efficient, which both takes precious seconds to cast and isn't always readily available. In more recent times, Yinlin suffers from not being able to do this ground takeoff technique due to the nature of her plunge attack. She can grapple, dodge, and then use flight though, as can every character. You might actually prefer the grapple technique, but I find it too awkward to do on controller. Since her release, Camellia has filled the role of lazy echo farmer for me. Just hold basic attack and press the shiny button when it lights up every now and then. There are some small hitches, however. She can only use AoE basic attacks after using her resonance skill, and dismounting afterwards can be a slight annoyance. Yes, we're getting incredibly pedantic here. Yinlin and Camellia are both incredible characters who I love dearly, but I couldn't help but feel that they were missing something when it came to solo echo farming. Enter Roccia. It's clear that Roccia is an excellent support for Camellia and a few others, given that her kit does a lot to increase havoc and basic attack damage, but her value far exceeds that, as we'll find out soon. Roccia is a 5-star Havoc attribute character who wields gauntlets. Well, Pero wields the gauntlets. Normally, the ideal support set for Roccia would be Moonlit Clouds, according to the wonderful Meiji, whose video will be linked in the description. Ironically, it barely overtakes Midnight Veil, a set that is supposed to be custom tailored for Roccia. At least, until Roccia is S4. Ouch. However, this very graph shows just how neck and neck these sets are, and I will argue that there's a very good reason to lose a percentage of team DPS by equipping the Midnight Veil set to make Roccia much more flexible. Back to Camellia, she's a Havoc character who primarily deals basic attack damage, and she's frighteningly powerful even with the free 4-star Sanhua as her support. In fact, according to Meiji, there's hardly any difference at all between Sanhua and Roccia in this role. For this reason, it's easy to brush Roccia aside in favor of characters who may benefit other teams more. Tower of Adversity won't clear itself after all. But how can you ensure quick tower clears without good echoes? While Roccia is intended to be a support who generates Concerto quickly and then swaps out, that's not all she's good for. Give her the Midnight Veil set with the right substats and you'll find out how interesting she can become as a solo character. Since she primarily deals heavy attack damage, you'll want to make sure her main echo is Nightmare Impermanence Heron, who, in spite of the terrible typo in its debut patch, boosts the wielder's heavy attack damage bonus. Typos aside, let's talk about solo Roccia. There are a few ways to raise her forte gauge, and you may want to take advantage of all of them for solo purposes. Each third of Roccia's gauge allows her to do one of her forte attacks, called Real Fantasy. You know the one. A full basic attack combo will fill up 2/3 of her gauge. Using her resonance skill increases her gauge by 1/3, or 2/3 at S1. And she can charge up her gauge with her heavy attack. Holding down the basic attack button will allow Roccia to charge up her forte gauge and then zoom toward her enemies. While charging, filling the gauge even the tiniest amount over a segment will fill that segment up once you release the charge. Conveniently, this charge will auto-lock onto enemies and then send Roccia into the air, ready to use Real Fantasy. Using her resonance skill will also launch Roccia into the air for the same reason. But why is Real Fantasy so important? Real Fantasy is a big AoE that gathers nearby enemies together, and it's also Roccia's biggest form of damage. This is the key to her amazing farming potential. Plus, I can't overstate just how handy her ability to group enemies together is. No more chasing enemies around or trying to fit them into your AoE. And just in case she wasn't perfect enough, Roccia can also do that flight trick I mentioned earlier. Quick AoE damage, enemy gathering, and the ability to fly at a moment's notice. These are all incredible traits for an Echo Farmer to have. But is that enough to make her the best Echo Farmer? We're going to put Roccia to the test to see just how good her solo damage is. To do that, we'll see what she can do at S0 with various weapons, and then move on to her damage at higher resonance chains. This is going to get expensive. So if you're enjoying this video so far, consider subscribing to the channel, it would help a lot. And with that, it's finally time to test Roccia out. These will be her stats, echoes, and skill levels for every test going forward. Far from ideal, as you can tell. All weapons will be R1. That means no duplicate weapons. And to start things off, this is S0 Roccia. In other words, we haven't gotten any duplicates for her yet. This is arguably the test that matters most, as it's what most people watching the video will have. As such, we're going to test her with a few different weapons. The standard weapon banner 5-star Abyss Surges, Shangli Yao's signature Verity's Handle, and her own signature Tragicomedy. The test will be simple. Have Roccia do some Real Fantasy attacks and see how long it takes for things to perish. First up, Abyss Surges. This 5-star standard banner weapon doesn't have a crit main stat, so it should be the worst of the bunch. I started by entering the leveling material stage in Huanglong. Since there's a group of enemies there that remain consistent, I figured they'd make a nice baseline for all these tests. Sorry, Roshroom. Being able to hit every enemy at once is incredibly satisfying, especially when the resonance skill comes out. This test is no problem for Abyss Surges, especially since Roccia conveniently dodges Roshroom's Vine Whip by being mid-bounce every time. Out in the overworld, common enemies are a delight to vanquish, and many elite enemies are fine too. Bulkier enemies, on the other hand, are kind of a nightmare to deal with. Wolves and knights don't feel worth the hassle at this power level, so it may be advisable to swap characters or quick swap to deal with them. Coincidentally, it's very easy to quick swap between every bounce of Real Fantasy, as Roccia stays airborne for a long time. Now onto Verity's Handle. Shangli Yao's signature weapon fortunately does have a crit rate main stat, so it should be a little better than Abyss Surges. I jumped right back into the leveling material stage and noticed immediately there tended to be less stragglers left behind. With Abyss Surges, Roccia wasn't always able to defeat the common enemies in this bunch as quickly. On the overworld, things felt quite a bit smoother with Verity's Handle. Bulkier elites are still a problem here, but everything else feels a little easier. Tragicomedy is Roccia's signature weapon, so naturally it's tailor-made to make her stronger. Besides its crit rate main stat and boost to attack, it increases heavy attack damage bonus by 48% every time basic attack is cast. This powers up Real Fantasy, so it suits our farming needs perfectly. And by the damage numbers, it really shows. At least, compared to Abyss Surges. In the leveling material stage test, Tragicomedy guaranteed there would be no stragglers by a certain point. But as usual, this stage couldn't stand up to Roccia. The difference may not be vastly superior to Verity's Handle, but again, the overworld felt smoother. And again, bulky elites are the enemy. So, what do I think of S0 Roccia's farming potential? Well, she actually makes life pretty nice, even if she's not exactly what I was looking for. Overall, she's an excellent addition to anyone's party thanks to the pull on her resonance skill alone. This gathering ability also makes her an excellent partner to co-op farm with. Your friends will definitely appreciate it. There are only some things she can comfortably do alone. Farming material stages is alright, but she struggles a bit when farming tacit fields or the overworld solo due to some stronger elite enemies. To make up for that, you can use her to gather up enemies, then swap to your favorite damage dealer to mop them up quickly. Her resonance skill comes off cooldown fast enough that you should have it for every group of enemies. Camellia in particular loves having Roccia around. Roccia can deal with the spread out common enemies that Camellia can't reach, and Camellia can destroy the bulky enemies S0 Roccia hates. But as I mentioned, this video is going to get expensive, so let's see how pulling duplicates impacts Roccia's farming potential. Just how many sequences will it take to turn Roccia into a truly independent farmer? Next, we'll be testing S2 Roccia. That's Roccia with 2 duplicates, which is attainable from the shop if you have enough extra coral lying around. She'll also be using Tragic Comedy for all the following tests. Why S2, you ask? For the purposes of farming echoes, we mostly care about sequences that modify Roccia's personal damage or impact real fantasy in some way. S2 happens to be the best starting point for that, but S1 has some pretty useful buffs for Roccia as well, so I'll talk about those first. At S1, Real Fantasy gets the nice quality of life improvement of being immune to interruption, though that's usually not a huge issue when casually echo farming. The more important feature it adds for our purposes is allowing her resonance skill to give 2/3 of her forte gauge instead of the usual 1/3, meaning you can do at least 2 Real Fantasy slams following it at any given time. Definitely nice, but ultimately fairly similar when it comes to farming. S2, on the other hand, adds a buff to Real Fantasy. 10% havoc damage bonus for the whole team for 30 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. I believe each stack applies right before each hit of Real Fantasy. Upon reaching max stacks, it grants 10% additional havoc damage bonus for 30 seconds. In other words, Real Fantasy will get progressively stronger the more times you use it, and she'll have 40% extra havoc damage bonus to unleash on anything that survives the first 2 slams. Scary stuff, but is it scary enough to turn her into a solo echo farmer? Well, the material farming stage went down very similarly to all the previous tests, but sometimes you don't need as many slams. Overworld TDs feel much more convenient to deal with, thanks to the 2/3 of gauge her S1 provides. But overall, the amount of effort needed to beat them doesn't feel hugely different. Bulky elite enemies feel a little more manageable, but still not great. At the end of the day, S2 Roccia isn't a hugely different experience when it comes to farming, but it is a little nicer. I wouldn't say it's worth chasing if all you want is comfortable echo farming. You could easily stop at S1 if you just wanted that quality of life. Getting those 2 bars of forte at once does feel pretty great once you get used to it after all, but S0 is perfectly fine as well. After S2, the next big boost for Real Fantasy is S4. While her S3 grants some nice personal damage in regular use cases by raising her crit rate and crit damage after activating her intro skill, this isn't a regular use case. We want her on field at all times, so it largely won't matter for farming. Unlike her S3, Roccia's S4 makes a big difference to Real Fantasy. Using her Resonance skill increases the damage bonus of Real Fantasy by a whopping 60% for 12 seconds. Will this be enough to wipe the floor with TDs in record timing? Onto the testing. Material stage is barely different, but slightly quicker, which doesn't really reflect the improvement overall. The main difference is that in order to get the damage boost, using the Resonance skill is a must. For farming, I like to get 1 charge of our forte gauge, use the Resonance skill to suck up the enemies and charge the rest of the gauge, and then go right into Real Fantasy. If anything survives, quickly use Real Fantasy again while that 12-second buff lasts. The increase in damage from this upgrade is incredible. Wolves no longer tormented me. Bulky elites felt better to defeat. Even knights felt a lot less annoying. There's no doubt about it, S4 gives Roccia what it takes to be a solo echo farmer. Just use her Resonance skill first and the destruction is unprecedented. If you're determined to make her feel very powerful, I think S4 is a great stopping point. That said, it's still really, really expensive, so you may want to think twice before committing to it. See if you can enjoy what she offers at S0 or even S1 first. Regardless, if S4 is already so busted, what good could S5 and S6 possibly be? Roccia's final 2 sequences are all about big personal damage, which is excellent as far as echo farming is concerned, but maybe just a little bit overkill. Let's start with S5. This sequence increases her Resonance Liberation's damage bonus by 20%, which is nice, but we don't want to waste time using that for farming. It doesn't stop there though. Its second effect is raising her heavy attack damage multiplier by 80%. You may recall that Real Fantasy is counted as heavy attack damage, so this should be pretty bonkers. Let's test the difference. S5 offers the first real difference to the material farming stage. After her Resonance skill is used, it usually ends after 3 slams. Likewise, on the overworld, most common enemies are obliterated in just 3 slams as long as you use the skill first. There's nothing that really poses a threat to Roccia by this stage. S5 Roccia is notably stronger thanks to the boost in heavy attack damage. Realistically, if you want the best of the best in terms of echo farming, this is as far as you need to go, and yet you can go further. If you want to turn Roccia into an absolute monster bent on destroying every living being around her, that's where her S6 comes in. For an absolutely horrific amount of money, her final sequence does absolutely nothing for overworld echo farming, unless you use her Resonance Liberation, which is something I don't want to do. Let me explain. At S6, after casting her Resonance Liberation, Roccia gains this laundry list of effects. Real Fantasy ignores 60% of enemies' defense. Very big. After the third slam of Real Fantasy, she launches back into the air to do an almost identical attack called Reality Recreation, which deals as much damage as the final hit of Real Fantasy. After Reality Recreation, she's launched back into the air, allowing her to keep slamming over and over again. As you can imagine, this takes her strongest attack and makes it even more devastating by several magnitudes, with the caveat that she has to use her Resonance Liberation to gain access to all this. But just look at her go! She can slam enemies up to 10 times in a row! Forget farming echoes, there's nothing left alive to use all these attacks on. We need to take her to a more worthy challenge. Unsurprisingly, the farming stage is the exact same at S6 because it's not worth it to use Roccia's Liberation here. Tacit Fields pose no threat either. Turn off your brain and slam slam slam. As for bosses, let's just say Nightmare Inferno Rider didn't stand a chance, in spite of how terribly I played here. This is the tool that Roccia needed to single-handedly take down anything that was standing in her way prior to this. There's nothing this girl can't easily farm, from those annoying bulky elites to bosses. Okay, there's one thing. When it comes to farming, the S6 bonus shines brightest in Tacit Fields. Since there are multiple waves of enemies, this is one of the best ways to get rid of them without turning on your brain. It's probably not worth it for bosses, considering how a much less invested Camellia can just obliterate them. As far as I'm concerned, Roccia is absolutely the best solo echo farmer in the game thus far, but she achieves this mostly by S4 or S5. Conclusion? Roccia may be a support character, but she's also potentially a beast when it comes to certain tasks, and one of those tasks happens to be echo farming. Even at S0, and even without her signature weapon, she can turn farming from a slog into a strangely addictive pastime. But is she worth it when Sanhua is right there? It's true that Sanhua will help you destroy bosses quickly, but that's it. Roccia can do the same while also improving your general gameplay experience outside boss content. Even if you don't want to use Roccia solo, being able to quickly swap to her and drag enemies together is worth its weight in gold, especially if you enjoy playing characters who aren't so focused on AoE damage. Not only that, but having her frees Sanhua up for a different team. So if you love Sanhua, now you can have twice the fun. That being said, if you don't value this sort of utility, there's no shame in not pulling Roccia. If a future character helps her shine even brighter, chances are Roccia will rerun again. Fortunately, Roccia meets all my highly specific demands for echo farming though. She never needs to be swapped out, she has quick, easy to use AoE damage and pulls any stragglers close to her with very little need to wait for cooldowns, and she doesn't need her liberation to deal great damage. However, she only meets that first point at higher investment, which is a bit of a cop-out. The more you invest in her sequences, the more destructive Roccia becomes, but please don't feel the need to invest extra into her. She's a great aid to farming at S0 too. As fun as S6 Roccia is, I want to get serious for a moment. Characters like Yinlin and Roccia fundamentally change at S6. That's a problem. Bigger numbers I can understand, but locking actual gameplay behind hundreds of dollars is a practice I'm not happy with. You know Kalkara's enhanced intro skill Necessary Means? In the second closed beta, before the game released, that skill was locked behind his S2. Rightfully, those of us who participated in CBT2 made some noise about that, and Kuro thankfully added it into his base kit. I think it goes to show that players really don't want core gameplay elements to be locked behind spending. I'm fortunate that I can do things like this because YouTube is my job, but that's not typical or even relatable. S6 Roccia is fun, but that fun shouldn't be unattainable for most players. There's nothing that can be done about characters who have already been released, but future characters don't have to have major gameplay mechanics locked behind a paywall. If you feel the same, add it to your feedback in the next survey. Kuro Games has proven time and time again that they listen. I felt this way with Yinlin, and I still feel this way with Roccia. Hopefully, it doesn't become a trend going forward because we as players deserve better than incomplete characters. In any case, Wuthering Waves is balanced around characters being S0, so please keep that in mind. Sorry for the mood whiplash, it just felt irresponsible to spend hundreds of dollars and not acknowledge how outrageous it is. Characters will come and go that are more powerful, so I'm sure the perfect free-to-play Echo Farmer will arrive one day. But for now, Roccia is an asset to every player, even at S0. If Roccia's echo farming skills aren't enough to convince you, you'll be glad to know she's an excellently written character as well. Find out why she's such a breath of fresh air in this video.